Welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing the cardiac cycle and cardiac electrophysiology. Okay, so what we've now talked about is the generation of the action potential in the sinoatrial node cells. What I now want to talk about is how this action potential can be propagated from sinoatrial node cells to surrounding cardiomyocytes that are non-sinoatrial node cells. Again, that mechanism of propagation will be the same as the mechanism of propagation between any two cardiomyocytes anywhere in the heart. And then what I want to talk about is the form that the action potential takes in these other cardiomyocytes. Okay, so this graph that we've got here and the ion channels involved in the sinoatrial node cardiomyocytes, that is specific to those cardiomyocytes and also to the cardiomyocytes of the AV node. So the cardiomyocytes of the AV node, they would do this as well, okay, at their own rate if you took them out and put them on a petri dish. Theirs will be slightly different because they're in overdrive suppression, as we've already discussed. So we'll come back to discussing the AV node later on. But if you took them out and put them on a petri dish without the sinoatrial node overdriving them, their action potentials would look exactly like this. It would just be that it would take longer for them to get up to the threshold potential, so this line would be less steep, and therefore the frequency of the action potentials would be lower, which is why they would generate the electrical signal at a lower frequency than the sinoatrial node cells. Okay, right, so what we want to talk about then is propagation to these neighbouring cardiomyocytes. And as I say, the form of the action potential in the other cardiomyocytes, the graph looks different, so I want to look at how it looks in other cardiomyocytes, and also there are different ion channels involved, which is the reason it looks different. Okay, so firstly then, conduction between a sinoatrial node cardiomyocyte and a atrial cardiomyocyte here, a more normal atrial cardiomyocyte. So let's say this is the sinoatrial node cardiomyocyte which we've just studied, and now here is our other cardiomyocyte. So how is the electrical signal that is being generated here going to propagate into this cardiomyocyte here? Well, there are what are known as electrical windows between the cells. There are these special channels through which positively charged ions can move. Okay, and these are known as gap junctions. So between neighbouring cardiomyocytes you have lots of these gap junctions, and these are little channels through which positively charged ions can move. Now, let's think about this. When the action potential in the sinoatrial node cell is occurring, the electrical potential intracellularly rises. Okay, we've talked about this. When the sodium ions initially come in, that raises the electrical potential intracellularly. When the calcium ions then come in, that raises the electrical potential intracellularly. In our neighbouring cardiomyocyte, the electrical potential intracellularly will still be at that same lower level. So now if we think about what the electrical potential differences from here to here, there is a step down. The electrical potential in this one is lower than the electrical potential in this one. So that now means that there is going to be a gradient which didn't exist previously. Okay, so previously there wasn't this electrical gradient between the intracellular compartments of these two cells. Now there is going to exist a gradient between the two, and positively charged ions are going to move through the gap junctions from the sinoatrial node cells to their surrounding cardiomyocytes, and this is what's then going to actually trigger an electrical signal in this cardiomyocyte here. So firstly, let's just say that this cardiomyocyte has an electrical potential difference across its cell membrane as well. The electrical potential difference across a normal cardiomyocyte is slightly greater than that across the sinoatrial node cells. It's slightly more negative, so if we start this graph here, it's actually going to start off at negative 80 millivolts. So if you step down from the extracellular fluid into the intracellular fluid, it can go down by up to negative 80 millivolts here in a more normal cardiomyocyte. Now, when the sinoatrial node cell has undergone an action potential, as I say, because of the gap junctions, we are going to get positive charge coming into the intracellular compartment here. What that is going to trigger is it's going to trigger the electrical potential intracellularly to go up. whilst the electrical potential extracellularly, that's not going to be changing. So this is going to then trigger a change in the electrical potential difference across the cell membrane. So let's say initially the electrical potential difference across the cell membrane was nice and resting at negative 80 millivolts. And this is the major difference between a cardiomyocyte that is a normal cardiomyocyte and a cardiomyocyte in the sinoatrial node area. A normal cardiomyocyte, if you just have it on a petri dish, its electrical potential difference across the cell membrane will just stay constant. It'll stay at negative 80 millivolts because they don't have the HCN channels which will be activated to open at the negative electrical potential differences. So they would just stay at this resting level unless they receive some positive charge through gap junctions, which is what's happening here. And now the sinoatrial node cell has generated its electrical activity, so positive charge is actually going to come through this gap junction like so. And what that is going to cause is it's going to cause depolarization of the electrical potential difference across the cell membrane up to now the threshold potential here, which is again around negative 40 millivolts here. So positive charge coming from the neighbouring cardiomyocyte, which in this case is a sinoatrial node cardiomyocyte, which has undergone an action potential, is what's going to drive the depolarization up to threshold potential in our normal cardiomyocyte here. Okay, and once you get up to threshold potential, again, you will now fire an action potential. A set or preordained sequence of changes in the electrical potential difference across the cell membrane will now follow, and this will constitute the electrical signal. So what's going to happen is this is going to cause voltage-gated ion channels, which were previously closed, to open. Okay, and here, it's not going to be T-type voltage-gated calcium channels. Those are quite unusual. Those are for the sinoatrial node. They're what cause the upstroke in the sinoatrial node cells. Okay, in these more normal cardiomyocytes, it's going to be voltage-gated sodium channels, which for short I'll abbreviate to VGNCs, N for Na, which is the symbol for sodium. Okay, and of course, when these open, sodium ions are going to move from the extracellular fluid into the intracellular fluid down their concentration gradient, and also down their electrical gradient, because at the moment the electrical potential intracellularly is still lower than the electrical potential extracellularly by 40 millivolts. Okay, and of course, when we move the sodium ions in, that's going to raise the electrical potential intracellularly, it's going to lower the electrical potential extracellularly, okay, and therefore the electrical potential difference across the cell membrane is just going to get more and more depolarized, and again it's going to go up to actually being positive levels up here, and it will get up to around plus 20 millivolts here, like so. So there is the upstroke of the action potential in a cardiomyocyte, or in a more normal cardiomyocyte, caused by firstly the depolarization due to receiving positive charge through gap junctions, and then due to the activation of voltage-gated sodium channels after we've reached threshold potential. Then, just like the T-type voltage-gated calcium channels, the voltage-gated sodium channels will then inactivate, and to open them again you need to firstly take the electrical potential difference back down to below threshold potential, and only then will they be able to open again. Okay, so they're now closed until we've repolarized the electrical potential difference across the cell membrane. Then what's going to happen is voltage-gated potassium channels are going to start opening. Now there are lots of different types of voltage-gated potassium channels, and they all take differing numbers of times to open. So I'll draw my voltage-gated potassium channel over here, although this is a little bit of an extremized picture, and I'll explain more what I mean by that in a moment. This should really be very close to this ion channel rather than at the other side of the cell, as this picture suggests here. Okay, but just for a picture, here is the voltage-gated potassium channels. Okay, so there are, as I say, there are lots of different voltage-gated potassium channels, and they all open in differing times. So they're all going to be activated to open at around threshold potential down here, the negative 40 millivolts, but they're all going to take different amounts of times to open. Some of them will open very quickly, and some of them will take even longer to open. Now the ones that are opening now are going to be the quick to open ones. Okay, so what's going to happen is some of these are going to open, they're going to allow potassium ions to move out, positive charge to move out. We know that will repolarize the electrical potential difference across the cell membrane, but actually it's only going to come down to here, and then it's going to actually level off for a little while, like so. Okay, and let me explain why. What's going to also happen is some voltage-gated calcium channels are going to open. So we're going to have another ion channel here, which I'll colour in pink here, and these are going to be another type of calcium channel known as the L-type voltage-gated calcium channel, and these have very different opening properties to the T-type voltage-gated calcium channel that we saw in the case of the sinoatrial node cells. The T-type voltage-gated calcium channel in the sinoatrial node cells, that opened extremely rapidly and closed extremely rapidly after being activated to open. The L-type voltage-gated calcium channels, they open much slower, so they were activated to open again at threshold potential. Everything's activated to open then. Okay, so by depolarization they were activated to open. They took longer to open, longer than the voltage-gated sodium channels and longer than the T-type voltage-gated calcium channels. So they're only going to be sort of activating to, well, they're only going to be opening at this sort of point. They were activated to open back here. And they will remain open for much longer than the T-type voltage-gated calcium channels. And of course they're going to allow calcium ions to come into the cytoplasm of the cell down their 15,000-fold concentration gradient. And that will be bringing positive charge into the cell. So temporarily these two balance each other out, because these are bringing calcium in, positive charge in, these are taking potassium out, so positive charge out. These two effects cancel each other out, so you get this flat phase in the action potential here, and you'll appreciate how different this is to the action potential that was generated in the sinoatrial node cells. And this phase of the action potential here is known as the plateau phase, and it's due to the balance between the calcium ions moving in and the potassium ions moving out. However, what will happen is the voltage-gated calcium channels will start to inactivate just like the voltage-gated sodium channels did, and again they won't be able to reopen until you've taken the electrical potential difference back down to negative 40 millivolts, reset everything. Okay, so they will start to close, and more voltage-gated potassium channels will start to open. So those ones that I said would take much longer to open. So I said there's lots of different types of voltage-gated potassium channels. Some open very quickly up here, some will only start to open down here. So what ends up happening is the voltage-gated potassium channels start dominating as the voltage-gated calcium channels close and more voltage-gated potassium channels open, so you get then a nice repolarization back down to negative 80 millivolts here, and then the voltage-gated potassium channels will start to close because we're back below their activating electrical potential difference of negative 40 millivolts. Okay, and then we'll get back down to negative 80 millivolts, and that then is this orderly sequence of changes in the electrical potential difference across the cell membrane of a cardiomyocyte, a more normal cardiomyocyte. So this is what the graph of an action potential is going to look like for a normal cardiomyocyte. A cardiomyocyte that is not a sinoatrial node cardiomyocyte and not an AV node cardiomyocyte. Now, there's something important that I need to tell you about right away. In the sinoatrial node cells, all the changes we were talking about were occurring all over the cell membrane of the entire sinoatrial node cell. Okay, everything was happening in phase and it was occurring all over that membrane, so everywhere. Here, it's not going to be occurring everywhere inside the cell membrane. So let me just draw this cardiomyocyte again here. So imagine that this is this same picture as I've got here. In fact, I'll just redraw the entire picture out rather than just trying to draw half of it out again. Okay, so here is our gap junction. What's going to be happening is cardiomyocytes, they're not massive cells, but they're not tiny cells. So when this positive charge comes in on one side here, you're only actually going to be getting this process activating in the neighbourhood here. Okay, so on this portion of the membrane here and on this portion of the membrane here, so all of this membrane, you are actually going to get this process occurring. So across this portion of the cell membrane, you will get the electrical signal generated, the action potential, this change in the electrical potential difference across the cell membrane occurring. And what's going to have to happen is it's going to have to propagate onto the neighbouring portions by a process known as saltatory conduction. And this is actually very similar to what happens in neurons. Okay, so when this portion of the membrane is undergoing this process, of course, in the upstroke you're bringing in lots of sodium ions. Okay, so lots of positive charge, and of course the intracellular compartment is in electrical, well, it's connected. Okay, the same sort of thing as we're talking about when we're talking about electrical equilibrium. Now, as I say, when I was talking about the fact that the intracellular compartment is in electrical equilibrium, I mean if you left the cell alone and it was not generating action potentials, then if you left it for long enough it would arrive in electrical equilibrium where the electrical potential everywhere intracellularly would be the same. That does not mean that transiently, over very short periods of time, you can get disturbances, uneven distribution of electrical potential inside the cell, and that's what's happening here. Okay, so these portions of the intracellular compartment are now going to have different electrical potentials to these portions, and what's going to then happen is positive charge is going to move from these portions to these portions, because these portions are now going to have more negative electrical potential than these portions, because we've raised the electrical potential here. Okay, so to try and re-establish an equilibrium, you're going to get positive charge moving here, and of course when you bring positive charge into this portion, it will raise the electrical potential intracellularly here, and then that will alter the electrical potential difference across the cell membrane at these portions here, which I'm now colouring in red, and it will depolarize it, depolarizing it potentially up to negative 40 millivolts, and that will then trigger an action potential here. And then the same thing will happen to the next portion of the membrane along. So when an action potential occurs here, it'll bring in positive charge, completely altering the electrical potential intracellularly here to a positive level, and then you'll get positive charge moving along to the intracellular compartment here, triggering an action potential here. Okay, so this concept is known as saltatory conduction. So the action potential is propagated along the cell membrane, so all the portions of cell membrane are going to participate one after each other in one of these action potentials, one of these electrical signals, this alteration in the electrical potential difference across the cell membrane. And this is said to be an example of saltatory conduction. Now, people often think that saltatory conduction is a term that you can only apply to action potentials. It isn't. Saltatory conduction is basically a fancy way of saying the domino effect. It's a fancy way of saying that a signal is propagated by one thing here, causing another thing here, causing another thing here, causing another thing here, causing another thing here. Okay, one domino falling over, causing another to fall over, causing another to fall over. This is one area of cell membrane undergoing an action potential, causing its neighbouring portion of cell membrane to undergo an action potential, causing its neighbouring portion of cell membrane to undergo an action potential. So it's an example of saltatory conduction, but this term refers to the domino effect. One bit causing the signal to occur, and the next bit causing the signal to occur, and the next bit, etc. So it can be applied in a much broader range of settings than just action potentials propagating along cell membranes. But this is an example of saltatory conduction. Okay, so that's how the signal is being propagated along the cell membranes by saltatory conduction. Now, let's then talk about how it's going to then propagate from this cardiomyocyte to the next one along. Well, what will happen is if we've got another atrial cardiomyocyte here, the two will be connected by gap junctions again. So when the action potential arrives here, again you'll get changes in the electrical potential intracellularly. Okay, it will become more positive, and again positive charge will move from one to the next. So this is how the electrical signal is propagated from cardiomyocyte to cardiomyocyte through these gap junctions, and it means that the action potential will go from one cardiomyocyte onto the cell membrane of the next, then it will propagate along the cell membrane of that cardiomyocyte by saltatory conduction, and then it'll go through gap junctions to the next cardiomyocyte. Okay, so that's how we have conduction of the electrical potential, well, the electrical signal from one cardiomyocyte to the next. Okay, right, so this form of the electrical signal then that we've talked about, this action potential, this is what you would see if you were to look at the action potential in an atrial cardiomyocyte, in a ventricular cardiomyocyte, and one of the cardiomyocytes on the specialized conduction system, so either the atrial conduction system or the ventricular conduction system. You would see something that looks like this only for the sinoatrial node and the AV node. Okay, so let me just talk about the AV node now. So the AV node, it looks exactly like this. However, this portion of the action potential in the AV node, the depolarization portion up to threshold potential, would not be caused by the HCN channels. Instead, it would just be caused by gap junctions in the more normal way. And the reason is that, yes, if you took an AV node cell out and left it on its own, nowhere near any sinoatrial node cells, then yes, they would generate rhythmic action potentials on their own using the HCN channels to generate this first portion here. Okay, however, in the heart, that's not what actually happens. The sinoatrial node cell is generating electrical signals at a much higher rate than the atrioventricular node cells would. So rather than the atrioventricular node cells being allowed to generate their own depolarization up to threshold potential with HCN channels, instead it occurs because other cardiomyocytes are giving them positive charge through gap junctions. Okay, and those, of course, have been those cardiomyocytes have got this electrical signal because of the sinoatrial node cells. But in the AV node, again, the action potential has this form where after you get up to threshold potential, T-type voltage-gated calcium channels open to cause the upstroke, and it looks simpler than the action potential in these ventricular cardiomyocytes and atrial cardiomyocytes and the conduction cardiomyocytes. The final thing to say is we talked about the fact that in the cardiomyocytes that are in the His-Purkinje system, okay, so those cardiomyocytes in that conduction system, they have pacemaker potential as well. So if you were to take them out and put them on a Petri dish on their own, again, they would trigger this first portion, so their action potential would look like this. Again, if they were on their own, the first portion would be far less steep than this, but it would be triggered by the HCN channels opening. So what you can imagine is having this really, really unsteep, like so. Okay, and then having the rest of it on the end. So you'd have something that looked like this maybe. So that would be the initial depolarization up to -40, and then it would look like this if you had them on their own. Okay, so they generate rhythmic action potentials on their own of this form, but that's not what usually happens. Usually the reason that they actually fire an action potential is not because their HCN channels are actually generating one automatically, it's because they're receiving positive charge from the neighbouring cardiomyocytes, which have been driven to have an action potential, fire an action potential, but by the sinoatrial node rhythm. Okay, so I hope then that that actually explains to you the nature of the electrical signal in cardiomyocytes and how it propagates between cardiomyocytes. So I hope what you can now do is put this all together in your head with all of the stuff that we've talked about, how the electrical signal actually propagates through the different portions of the heart, and then how we've talked about how this generates the cardiac cycle, to have a complete understanding of how the heart actually works. So we'll end this discussion here.